Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is an architect turned cattle rancher and is the author of the memoir 20 Miles of Fence, Blueprint of a Cowboy, which he co-wrote with Janet Fogg. His name is Robert West, or Bob West for short, and here's my interview with Bob. Bob West, welcome to Apollo Papyrus.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I appreciate you having me on.
What was your work as an architect in Colorado like, and what caused you to give up that career?
Well, I started architecture right out of college. I went to the University of Colorado, and I started at a really good firm in Boulder, Colorado, doing great work. And in 1986, I started in 1979. In 1986, we had a recession in Colorado. And the firm was essentially going bankrupt around me. We went from 30 people to 6. And I was one of the last persons standing. And we were selling the conference furniture out of the conference room when a client came in, a developer client that I knew. And fortunately, he looked past the issues of selling the furniture and hired us, and we saved the firm. We later joined with another small firm in Denver, and in 10 years, we along with partners built the largest firm in Colorado, the largest architectural firm, with 275 people, 5 offices. And so I had a 35-year career in architecture, doing some amazing work all across Colorado and other places in the United States. And real quickly, what occurred was in 1993, my wife and I and 2 boys and a stepson were living in Boulder on a little ranchette with 2 horses in the backyard. And I was working 65 hours a day, as you do in these types of ventures. And my kids would only see me during the week on television at some city council meeting trying to get a project approved. So very quickly, my wife said, hey, we've got to go find a place where we can travel to on the weekends within 3 hours, and we can get away from the phones and all the hustle and bustle of 3.5 million people. Well, after 2.5 years of looking, we ended up with a cattle ranch, believe it or not. We weren't looking for a cattle ranch in Wheatland, Wyoming, and we knew nothing about cattle.
What is life on a cattle ranch like, and why did you sell a large ranch in Wyoming to buy a smaller ranch in Colorado?
Well, the book kind of goes through that. The book is a memoir of that period where we owned the ranch for about 12 years. Unfortunately, I ended up getting a divorce, which was a big surprise. And I never expected to buy another ranch. And sure enough, a few years later, I ran across a small ranch with my new partner in Livermore, Colorado, much smaller, only about 100 acres. And I didn't think I was going to buy it. And sure enough, it was another recession, and the price came down to the point where I couldn't not buy it. So I did. And so what caused me really to quit architecture was I was commuting. It's about a 2-hour run through down to Denver through a lot of traffic, and I was doing that for about 1.5 years. And I finally said, "Hey, I'm just gonna stay on this ranch and be a cowboy." Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm
No.
still there.
Okay, good.
Without spoiling too much of your book, 20 Miles of Fence, Blueprint of a Cowboy, what is your book about?
Well, it really is a book that was written by myself and a really good friend of mine, Janet Fogg, who was the CFO at my architectural firm. She quit a little bit earlier than I did and became a writer and wrote about 10 books. And she was reading a journal of mine that I kept through the 10 or 12 years of owning that ranch. And she said to me, I think there's a book here. So we started writing this book, and essentially what it is it's a smaller version of Yellowstone without the train station, if you've watched that show. And it's also a combination of City Slickers, which is an old movie that people really loved about, I don't know, 25 years ago about, guys not knowing anything about cattle, doing cattle drives and such. And so the thing about it is it's honest and it's real. And I was very self-deprecating about, the fact I knew nothing. And so there's lots of kind of funny stories as well as heartbreaking stories in the book.
Your book has been described as the television series Yellowstone meets the movie City Slickers. What does that mean?
Well, Yellowstone is a really fantastic series that's really popular, um, starred by Kevin Costner, and it is, I think, one of the best shows that's been on television about actually seeing cattle ranching in reality. And then City Slickers being so based upon somebody that doesn't know anything about cattle going out and having to save this gentleman's herd and drive it, across the country to where it was going. Because I think the guy died, if I remember correctly, along the way. So that's really why it's considered both, because our I knew nothing about cattle ranching. Fortunately, the previous owner, stayed for a year, and I was able to go up on Friday afternoons, sit in his truck on Saturday mornings for 2 or 3 hours, and he taught me how to be a cowboy over the year that he was there.
What was it like to discover your immigrant ancestors' impact on the American Civil War and the wars against Native American tribes?
Well, that was a big surprise, and that's a fun part of the book. It's I believe in destiny, and we looked at probably over 40 properties. We had two properties under contract that fell through during that 2.5 year search. We ended up in Wheatland kind of by accident. The ranch that we ended up buying was not for sale, but the previous owner was 75 and he had had a heart attack, and his kids did not want to ranch any further. So our realtor said, "Hey, we were about done looking because my kids were tired about being hauled around every weekend in the back of a minivan all over the countryside." And we came upon this ranch and ended up buying it. Well, my family ended up having a family reunion during the time that we owned the ranch up in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And part of the reason they were there was to go to Fort Laramie because my great great grandfather was a captain, and he actually was at Fort Laramie, which is only about an hour from the ranch. And so it turns out that I discovered and what's really interesting is my first job at my architectural firm was doing some historical preservation at Fort Laramie, but I never went up there. So I never knew any of this history. Turns out my great grandfather had been on that ranch back in about 1870. So, I kind of believe in destiny on how I ended up there. And he was a Civil War hero, and fought in many of the famous battles in the Civil War.
How long did it take you to write your book, and what were the easiest and hardest parts of writing a book for the first time?
Well, since I had help, that was really important. I could not have done this by myself. Janet was an excellent writer. And so what I would do is I had to portray the experiences, the grit, the dirt, the grime, of the actual daily occurrences on this ranch. And so I would put together that, and then I would send it to her, and she would make it sing. And it took us 14 years because when she sat on the porch and we read the journal, we were both really busy at the time. We started writing and we both kind of had other issues, in our lives, and we ended up finishing it during COVID when we both had, a lot more at home time. And so it really took us about 2 years to finish the book when we had time to sit down. She said, this book would probably take, I don't know, 3 to 5 years to get it published and probably 50 inquiries because there's so many books out there trying to be published. Well, we sent it out and we got a call the next day from the University of Nebraska Press, Bison Books, and they wanted to do the book. If you'd allow me, I want to read something to you that Janet wrote, and this will explain how we work together.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is good and it's short. We had to, I had to explain, what it was like in Wyoming. And so she didn't live the life. So I tried to do my best, and then here's what she wrote. And this is the epigraph for the book. How do you describe the utter vastness of Wyoming prairie? The smell, the clarity of the air, the inability to judge distance, the solitude, where you can hear the sun set. That's pretty special words from a great lady.
Now, who was the major publisher that published your book, and how were you able to get a major publisher to publish it?
Well, I believe that they were looking for this type of book. The publisher, of course, was, as I mentioned, Bison Books, who really they really look for books that are west of the Mississippi, having to do with Western culture. And I believe that the first chapter, you send in inquiry with the foreword and your first chapter, and then a list of all of the chapters that you have in the book. We sent in the foreword and the first chapter, and the first chapter was very strong. It was about the first time I came to the ranch after we bought it, and I got lost because the ranch was 18 miles in the middle of nowhere on a dirt and partially asphalt road. And I really didn't pay attention to how we got there because the realtor always took us there during the due diligence and during the buying part of it. And so, back then we didn't have, iPhones with maps. So, the first chapter is really, really good. And I think that hooked the editor that reviewed it. And that's why we got a call back the next day. And I think they were looking for this type of book because of the interest across the country in Yellowstone and some of the sequels of that show, some of the highest rated television shows in the country.
How much of a culture shock was it for you to go from working as an architect and living in a urban area slash college town to living and working on a cattle ranch?
Well, it was a huge clash of culture, as you can imagine. Here I am in quite liberal Boulder, Colorado. And then you all of a sudden, 3.5 hours later, you're transformed back in time almost to an area that's very conservative with ranchers of multi-generational background and history. They didn't like Coloradoans very much in Wyoming. They called us greenies because of our green license plates. And I was accepted by them. And I really, I dedicated the book to the ranchers up there because, they taught us everything we had to know and they were very welcoming. But here's an example of the cultural clash. I had a partner who was a real estate agent, big real estate consultant in Denver. And we had our first time of haying the hay ground. And he showed up to do his haying, which is a very grimy, dirty business, with lots of sweat and that kind of thing going on. And he shows up in a convertible BMW with penny loafers with no socks and Dockers and a short sleeve shirt. So, had no clue what we were doing that day and what it meant, to actually put hay up and how you needed to dress to do that, so on. So there's an example.
I'm going to finish this interview with kind of a long political question. It's going to be more nuanced than probably any political question I've ever asked on this podcast. Today, there are a lot of disagreements involving use of land and natural resources, agriculture, and resource extraction's impact on global climate change, urban sprawl, and property rights. And these are all hot button issues in the Intermountain West region of the United States. What are some of your thoughts about these issues?
Well, that's a lot of what that book is about. And I'm actually writing a second book right now that's going to be talking a whole lot about those issues. As we know, there's a big divide between urban and rural in the United States and actually across the world, as you see the farmers revolting in Europe in high numbers. And it's just, in my opinion, it's not understanding the differences between living in an urban center versus living out in a rural area. And almost everything that happens between the two places is different. I'll give you an example. Electric vehicles make sense if you're living in an urban city. You have maybe solar panels, on your house, and you have a charger in your garage, and you go out and you get groceries, and you're within a certain radius of your home. It doesn't work at all in rural areas where charging stations are few and far between. You need trucks that can haul huge loads like horses and cattle and trailers. And you have to have power to do that. You can't, have a Ford Lightning 150 that runs out of power in 30 miles because it's towing a big load. So, there's an example where the conflict exists. Another example is the wolf reintroduction in Colorado. I have nothing against wolves. As a matter of fact, there's a section in my book where I say, I was one of the only cowboys that didn't kill coyotes because I didn't believe they actually caused that much trouble on ranches. But wolves coming to Colorado are putting tremendous stress on cattle ranchers. And it was really voted on by the urban population and won by a very slim margin. So, the urban population isn't affected by wolves in the environment, it's the rural. And so we have a lot. I can go, down probably 50 items like that and talk about both sides. And of course, I've lived both sides. So I have a really good understanding of private property rights, why they're different, in rural areas versus urban, and all of the issues that you would like to talk about. I would suggest that after I finish my next book, let's have another conversation. We can talk the entire time about that.
Yeah, I live in an area, it's kind of a small, kind of former coal mining town, but it's surrounded by farmland, and there's a small city several miles north of where I live. So I'm kind of in between an urban and rural lifestyle. I'm very much a townie, though.
Yes. Well, you mentioned global warming and those issues. It's interesting with cattle. The biggest issues with methane in cattle are feedlots. I switched from having Black Angus cows up in Wyoming to Scottish Highland cattle, which are those hairy hippie cows with horns that everybody loves all over the country now. They're becoming very popular. One of the reasons I switched was because they're grass eaters. They don't go into feedlots. So I use what's called regenerative ranching here, where all their manure that goes back on the hay fields as a fertilizer. And I don't use any sort of chemical fertilizers. I rarely use herbicides. So my ranch right now is carbon positive. the way that I ranch. Now, the problem is you can't feed the masses by having cows just eat grass. And that's why they have to go into feedlots, because we don't have enough grass, plus the timing required to get them to market. So, but there are ways that, we can reduce the carbon footprint, and they're looking at that right now in the way of feed and other things. So, there are answers to all of these conflicts that we have between ourselves, I believe, in this country. We just can't talk anymore to each other. There's too much vitriol and too much standing on, the very edge of the issue rather than talking about the middle. I think if we could talk about the middle, we could solve almost all of these issues.
Bob, you were an intriguing guest. I thank you for appearing on Apollo Papyrus, and I'll be open to interviewing you after your second book's published.
Well, I would love to do that. We could spend a lot of detail, and I think your audience would find that really interesting. But in the meantime, you can watch me on Facebook, Robert Bob West, or Whiskey Bell Ranch, and you can see some of my architecture, and you can see what I do every day with these Highland cattle. I think your audience would find that interesting.
Bob was one of the most interesting guests I've ever had the opportunity to interview for this podcast, and it was wonderful to interview him. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write and read your passion. Bye for now. Remember to subscribe to the Apollo Papyrus YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/@ApolloPapyrus and the Apollo Papyrus Substack newsletter at apollopapyrus.substack.com. Y'all can visit the Apollo Papyrus website at campaaronapollo.witsite.com/Apollo Papyrus and follow Apollo Papyrus on Threads, Instagram, Facebook, and Tumblr at Apollo Papyrus. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.